Our next speaker is a person of great academic accomplishment. Teresa Bejan is Associate Professor of Political Theory in the Department of Politics and International Relations at the University of Oxford, and she is a Fellow of Oriel College. She received her PhD with distinction from Yale University in 2013 and received the American Political Science Association's 2015 Leo Strauss Award for the Best Doctoral Dissertation in Political Philosophy. In 2016, she was elected as the final Balzan Skinner Fellow in Modern Intellectual History at the University of Cambridge. Her book, Mere Civility, Disagreement and the Limits of Toleration, will be published by Harvard University Press in 2017. Please welcome Teresa Bejan.
Well, thank you, Tom, for that introduction and also just for inviting me. Unlike the previous speakers, I didn't actually contribute to the volume, but I've been listening to the talks with considerable interest, and I think that actually what I'm going to speak about dovetails quite nicely with several of the comments that have been made by previous speakers. So the title of my talk today is Persecution of the Tongue and the Rise of Religious Insult. And it's actually based on the first chapter of my book, which Tom mentioned, which is coming out next month with Harvard University Press. It's available for pre-order on Amazon. Everyone should run and go order it. But anyway, so what the book does, it examines appeals to the concept of civility in 17th century debates about religious toleration in England and her American colonies. And specifically what I think those debates can tell us about our own sort of crisis of civility, about which you hear very much in the United States today, but also in other Western liberal democracies. And so in keeping with the theme of the conference, I want to focus in my remarks on only one small part of that history that I discuss in the book. But it's one I think that's really important for understanding the contemporary controversies about blasphemy and freedom of expression that we've been hearing about already, and specifically questions about how to govern speech in aspirationally tolerant societies, whether in the 17th century or the 21st century. And so, this obviously comes up with questions of blasphemy, but what I'm going to speak about is the issue of religious insult, which has come up a little bit, but I think that is increasingly the central category in which we're sort of confronting such issues in law in modern liberal democracies. Anyway, so the question, here I put on my political theory cap, the question that sort of motivates the book in my comments here is sort of what is the proper relationship between religious toleration on the one hand and free expression on the other. Specifically, is some speech about others and their religious commitments so offensive, so insulting, so degrading and disrespectful that it actually constitutes a form of persecution against which a tolerant society can and should act. And so in recent debates about hate speech laws in Europe and the United States, these questions have been at the forefront, and the answer, at least in most Western liberal democracies, has been an emphatic yes, right? And its persistent rejection of laws against hate speech and religious insult. The United States, where I'm from, remains a bit of an outlier, as we sort of heard in the last speech. And so Americans' idiosyncratic, First Amendment faith, or free speech fundamentalism, as Stanley Fish might call it with an imputation of unsavory evangelical zeal, sees the freedoms of religion and of speech as equally sacred, intimately connected, and entirely consistent, right? And this is expressed in the First Amendment, in which all of these freedoms are contained in one amendment and sort of seen as being mutually reinforcing and of a piece. And the third, of course, is the freedom of association. So this view represents an entirely different vision of a tolerant society than that underlying legislative regimes against religious insult. And in the book, I'm concerned to sort of trace the emergence of that vision of a tolerant society historically as well as theoretically. But at the heart of the conflict between proponents of religious insult laws and proponents of the First Amendment, I think, is a disagreement about the meaning of toleration and what it requires from individuals as well as institutions. So in examining this kind of divergence, I think political theorists often fall back on sort of historical meta-narratives that locate the emergence of liberalism, especially in its Anglo-American iteration, out of the theory and practice of religious toleration in early modern Europe. So we've already heard that actually a couple times today. So we trace this history to early modernity. And so on this view, an unconcern with incivility can be traced to liberalism's origins in arguments aimed at ending persecution and religious violence, and not kind of private attitudes of intolerance as such. So this original neglect of the war of words in favor of swords, if true, would seem to reaffirm the idea that when it comes to the challenges facing modern multi-ethnic and multi-faith democracies, the traditional answers of liberal political thought, and specifically the free speech answer to the question of how, we should govern language in a tolerant society, well, they seem to sort of singularly ill-equipped, right? So it's an outdated solution. Our problems are altogether different. So in complaints about a current crisis of civility, for instance, one often hears that the internet is to blame, along with processes of globalization and technological innovations unique to the modern world. But concerns about the propensity for fundamental disagreements to become heated and hateful are hardly exclusively modern afflictions. And it's always worth remembering that the English word polemic derives from the ancient Greek for war. But also, if you go back to 500 years to the Reformation, and specifically to Erasmus, who began his tract *The Tongue* in 1525 with an altogether familiar complaint, right? Erasmus writes, quote, "Nowadays a backbiting tongue does not spare any man, and calumny is common practice." Familiar lamentation. But what troubled Erasmus in particular were the rampant religious insults polluting the post-Reformation public sphere. Wars of words, he feared, that would not only shatter the vinculum societatis, or sort of social bond of religious unity, but also the spiritual peace and harmony of concordia, right? So this ideal of a kind of shared heart in the corpus Christianum, in the sort of body of Christians in the visible church. So the problem of verbal persecution came to the fore after the Reformation, due in part to Martin Luther's own vitriolic example. For instance, in the murder of Dresden, Luther declared, quote, "I am unable to pray without at the same time cursing. If I am prompted to say, 'Hallowed be thy name,' I must add, 'Cursed, damned, and outraged be the name of the papists, and all of those who slander your name.' Thus orally, every day, and in my heart without intermission, and I am well convinced that God will hear my prayers." Right, and Luther also reminded his followers that the Greek evangel, in addition to meaning good news, also meant to shout. And many of the Protestant sects that emerged in the ensuing years took Luther's advice to heart, often to his chagrin, but they inventing their own anathemas and experimenting with evangelical activities that were deliberately offensive to public mores and to public order. And this includes the Quaker practice of going naked for a sign, among other things. So in any case, the dissolution of Christendom into competing sects after the Reformation was hastened by this process, but also by that recent advancement in communications technology, the printing press, right, which allowed Catholics and Protestants and then sectarians to publicize their theological disputes and vigorously anathematize their opponents at this sort of unprecedented rate. So the Protestant fondness for anathematizing Catholics as papists and anti-Christians, so literally followers of the papal Antichrist, originates here. Catholics, of course, gave as good as they got with, traditional labels of heretic and schismatic. But also, the other crucial point, though, is that the period, in this process, you begin to see the coining of a lot of other really imaginative terms of religious abuse. So sectarian labels, actually literally denominations, so names, that today to us seem really uncontroversial. Names like Quaker, Baptist, even Lutheran, right? The name Lutheran is included in the papal bull excommunicating Luther, sort of so that his followers will share his infamy, right? So Lutheran starts as this insult, and they're able really to deeply wound a believer's tender conscience. So, in 1660, when the Puritan preacher Thomas Watson warned his fellow Christians to, quote, "take heed of becoming persecutors. For some think there is no persecution but fire and sword, but there is the persecution of the tongue. And there are many of these persecutors nowadays." And this is the process that he had in mind. And it's, of course, again, Puritan itself started as an insult to describe the hotter sort of Protestants within the Anglican establishment. So Watson's suggestion that persecution was not simply a matter of swords, but of words, points us towards what contemporary critics of liberal toleration, free speech fundamentalism might miss. So far from being indifferent to hateful speech, the problem of toleration and that it aimed to address in the early modern period was not just religious diversity or violence, which after all predated the Reformation, but specifically the emergence of a sort of newly intense kind of religious disagreement. right? And this advent of a particularly uncivil sectarian disagreement brought about by new disruptive modes of evangelism and also by these technological innovations that sort of, then amplify the volume on what's going on. So the idea that these wars of words would lead inevitably to wars of swords in the 16th and 17th century, that seemed pretty reasonable. We might think that Michel de l'Hopital in 1561, to the Estates General of Orleans, when he says, it's folly to expect quiet, peace, and friendship among persons of various denominations. For diversity and opposition of sentiment, in the face of this, it's difficult for men to refrain from taking up arms. Thus, war follows closely on and accompanies discord in speech. Right? That's L'Hopital. And in the face of this rising polemical tide, irenic writers like Erasmus, so named because they wanted to restore peace in the church, were also concerned about the propensity of Christians to go to war, but the concern went deeper to this issue of concordia, to their vision of a sort of harmonious and healthy society as having this kind of this mutual recognition and sort of a shared heart, right? And so this evangelical sectarianism for them is actually an enthusiastic dismemberment, both figuratively and literally, of the body of Christ. You're hacking the body of Christ to pieces in anathematizing one another in this way. So what can be done? Well, Erasmus criticized his contemporaries' unwillingness to take action. He actually recommends the Solonian law against, contemning the dead as a good model for the kind of, strategy we might want to adopt. But at the same time that Erasmus is complaining that people aren't taking legal action against persecution of the tongue, proponents of persecution, who are trying to restore uniformity, see that as what they're doing as well. So it's not just that they're trying to get rid of dissent. What they're trying to do also is to tamp down on these really uncivil disagreements. And so one of the big points I make in the book is simply to say that, in the 17th century, it's not just proponents of persecution who are worried about persecution of the tongue. It's also proponents of religious toleration themselves. And actually, specifically, they have it's an uphill climb for them because their opponents quite rightly point out that having a system of toleration where you actually permit the expression of religious differences, that's just an invitation to make these wars of words worse. You're bringing sectarians into closer contact and encouraging them to compete, right? So again, concordia is just going to dissolve into discord and din. And so I had a PowerPoint, but one of the things I wanted to show you is just in this brief window between the abolition of the Star Chamber in 1641, and the enactment then of the Licensing Act by the Long Parliament in 1643, you see this moment that there's this sort of freeing up of the press. And in that moment, the English markets are flooded with polemical pamphlets featuring imaginative insults, group libels, and obscene images that made the war of words all the more colorful, right? So you just have this 2-year window. You can see why people are freaking out about the idea that you would allow this unregulated sectarian evangelism. Right? So for advocates of toleration or indulgence in the period, the chief theoretical and practical challenge for them becomes how to civilize the disagreements that a policy of toleration would seem to inevitably encourage. So that early modern complaints about the malign effects of men's lingual liberty, as some called it, would lead quickly to attempts to bridle men's tongues through law. That shouldn't come as a surprise, right? And the strategies pursued can sound awfully familiar. So, of course, blasphemy is, one of these strategies. But one in which these issues of religious insult come in as well. It's this attempt to tie certain modes of religious expression or worship with sedition, right? So, the Elizabethan policy, for instance, banning prophesying. The practice of prophesying. So that's an attempt to crack down on evangelism, but it's also an attempt to crack down on sort of these conventicles, these informal religious associations, right, by linking them with sedition. Another strategy, perhaps inspired by the ubiquitous handbooks of civil conversation, which were very popular in the period, was to try to impose a civil silence on religious questions, right? So Baudin, in the 6 Books of the Republic, he praises the King of Muscovy, who, quote, seeing his people divided into diverse sects and factions by reasons of diverse preaching and disputations of the ministers, thereupon forbade all of them upon pain of death anymore to preach or dispute about religion, right? And it's not just Baudin's philosophical imagination here, and there were, in the 1555 Peace of Augsburg, there are there are implemented sort of discussion bans in certain German towns. But again, it's not just the proponents of persecution who are arguing for these kinds of regulations. In the Netherlands, an English visitor to the Netherlands in the 17th century notes that neighborhood statutes prohibiting, quote, any discourse about religion for fear of falling out were actually quite common, right? So the idea that coexistence requires this kind of regulation of speech, of governing the tongue. But then finally, so you have these strategies of sort of that target religious speech broadly, but then you also have these attempts to sort of cast the net more narrowly by focusing on the persecution of the tongue in particular. So in France, L'Hôpital, he tried this tactic. He enjoined his countrymen to avoid those, quote, devilish names of parties, factions, and rebellions, those names of Lutherans, Huguenot, and Papist. And actually then in 1561, a royal edict follows that actually bans the words Huguenot and Papist, right, as a way of trying to restore social harmony and concord. In England, in the reigns of Henry VIII and then both of his daughters respectively, you get these injunctions against contumelious words, hypocrite, papist, Pharisee. And yet in England, in the 17th century, the most vocal supporters of early modern bans on persecution of the tongue were not absolutist opponents of the liberty of conscience, but rather the primary targets of religious insult themselves, namely dissenters, right? So while some sectarians are grudgingly appropriating the denominations bestowed upon them by their opponents, others are calling for laws for those terms to be banned, right? Words like Quaker, words like Prattlingstons, in pick-thankly knaves, sort of singled out as a problem. So in 1626, John Yates declares, quote, "I could wish with all my heart that this offensive name of Puritan, wandering at large, might have some statute passed upon it, both to define it and punish it, for certainly Satan gains much by the free use of it." Right? It's the use of this word, Puritan, that's actually leading to all this conflict. So if we ban the word, then surely we'll all just get along. Right? So today, many scholars assume that hate speech laws emerged only in the 20th century as a response to the horrors of the Holocaust. But my book details how that it's after the Reformation that these religious insults that are really close to modern hate speech laws really get going, and they get enacted both in the intolerant societies of the old world and in these officially tolerant societies of the new. So in particular, colonies like Pennsylvania and Maryland that are being marketed as sort of safe havens for religious refugees, right? Both places have religious insult statutes on the books. So just for instance, in Maryland, which is a Catholic colony, the Toleration Act of 1649 not only protected quote-unquote free exercise of religion, so you get that phrase, but also included the following exhaustive provision, quote, "Whatsoever person or persons shall henceforth upon any occasion, in a reproachful manner or way, declare, call, or denominate any person or persons whatsoever, a heretic, schismatic, idolater, Puritan, independent, Presbyterian, Popish priest, Jesuit, Jesuited papist, Lutheran, Calvinist, Anabaptist, Brownist, Antinomian, Barrowist, Roundhead, Separatist, or any other name or term, in a reproachful manner, relating to matter of religion, shall for every such offense forfeit and lose the sum of 10 shillings sterling." Right? And Maryland wasn't alone. So you get these similar statutes in Pennsylvania, and then, in most fascinating for a student of political philosophy, you get them in the colony of Carolina, and in the fundamental constitutions of Carolina, in which John Locke had some hand in composing, right? So, in the book I sort of wrestle with how we should understand Locke's thinking and his relationship to that provision. But in any case, these colonial provisions have been consistently overlooked by scholars, and yet their similarity to modern day religious insult laws and their contrast with the First Amendment is really striking, right? So while the Anglo-American liberal tradition is often accused of a characteristic deafness to the harm in hate speech, I want to argue that, many of the usual suspects or even patron saints of that tradition, including Locke, took the problem of religious insult very seriously. So seriously that they're seriously engaging with whether or not bans on persecution of the tongue are a good idea. Anyway, so I don't have time to sort of go into that. I'm just going to end by talking about the person who's really the hero of the book and is not necessarily often part of this conversation, and that's Roger Williams, the founder of Rhode Island. So Rhode Island is really unique in being one of these tolerant colonies, and yet it's unique in not actually enacting one of these provisions, right? And I think that has a lot to do with Williams's own understanding of what religious toleration entails. So Williams, like many Puritan refugees in the New World, was deeply troubled by persecution of the tongue, especially as practiced by those paragons of incivility, the Quakers. Nevertheless, he rejected laws against it. And his evangelical reasons for doing so, I think, are particularly interesting because they fall so emphatically short of the kind of, idea that toleration must entail respect for difference that you hear increasingly in political and legal theory today. But at the same time, those arguments end up supporting institutional arrangements that are unique to the extent to which they actually conform to what a liberal constitutional arrangement we're told should look like. So in Rhode Island, you get that characteristic combination of disestablishment, free association, free expression, right? The sort of institutions that we associate with liberal toleration, but in fact exist in very few liberal democracies. In Rhode Island, you actually get them, and it's the most tolerant society in the world in the 17th century, and for a long time thereafter, right? So Williams's sort of evangelical arguments for this liberal and inclusive toleration, which included Jews, Turks, pagans, as well as Catholic anti-Christians, which is huge, that you would tolerate Catholics. It's made it Williams attractive to people like Martha Nussbaum, who want to sort of revive him as this kind of liberal, secular liberal patron saint of la lettre, right? But she and others explicitly ignore the kind of evangelical side of this. But William is really explicit. I mean, he says, quote, "He that is a briar, that is a Jew, a Turk, a pagan, or an anti-Christian today, may be, when the word of the Lord runs freely, a member of Jesus Christ tomorrow." So this idea that process, this evangelical toleration that demands that the word of the Lord, that the gospel run freely, sort of unimpeded, that's what's really key for Williams. And he's well aware that people on the receiving end often find evangelism decidedly uncivil. Even he acknowledged that his banishment from Massachusetts had something to do with his constant admonishing them of their unclean walking. For this reason, he believed that legal restrictions on religious insults or offensive names would impede evangelical activity by effectively targeting, quote, all true preaching of the gospel or glad news, which was properly done in a zealous, immovable, constant, and resolved way. And that's very much Williams' ethos. Anyway, and so Williams here provides a really interesting contrast with Locke, who will later on sort of reject the kind of religious insult provision that we find in the Carolina article. But he does so exclusively on prudential grounds. So in Locke, you're never going to find a kind of principled free speech argument in the way that the casual reader of the Second Treatise of Government might hope. You're never going to get it. It's entirely prudential. And in the letter concerning toleration, I argue, Locke actually revives, and I think that this actually dovetails with what David was saying earlier, he revives this sense of toleration as a kind of vision of a harmonious community, right? So reviving this idea of concord. As this mutually respectful way of differing, right? He says that people are going to have to give up their fiery zeal for their own sect in order to make a tolerant society work. Of course, that's anathema to Williams. For Williams, a tolerant society is only a tolerant society if it accommodates the fiery zeal for one's own sect, right? And so I'll end there. Just to say that, if we want to understand, it's too easy to draw a direct line from the crazy stuff that Roger Williams was doing in Rhode Island in the 17th century to the First Amendment. But I think that, by looking at his example, we see just how rare that institutional combination is that we tend to take for granted as the liberal solution. In fact, it's not. Most Western liberal democracies do not have that peculiar arrangement. And it also can help us make sense of the kind of uneasy place of evangelical Christianity increasingly in Europe, especially so if you look at recent cases involving Jehovah's Witnesses in the European Court of Human Rights. Jehovah's Witnesses are precisely the kinds of evangelical Christians who are going to highlight this tension between free exercise and free expression. Right, and so the increasing claim to a kind of negative religious freedom from being proselytized to or at, I think that there we're seeing a lot of these issues that were raised in the 17th century coming to the fore again. That's all I got.